Labour has announced that it will drop its already limited plan for a grooming gang inquiry. In January, the Home Secretary announced 5 local inquiries into grooming gangs. There was, I think, £5 million was apportioned. This is now no longer being given to councils. There's an opt-in situation. Bradford Council has already said it doesn't need an independent grooming gang inquiry, which is slightly suspicious. I guess the central problem is that when you hand over control to local councils, where these issues have been endemic, you're essentially asking these councils to investigate themselves. So many thousands of girls were let down by social services, by local police departments, and by local councils, and were raped, across the country, many thousands of vulnerable young girls, and these local institutions were complicit. To illustrate that, Katie Lamb, the MP, was speaking in the Commons recently, and also in private discussions, Charlie Peters, who does so much of the investigation on this, has noted these 2 cases. Firstly, the case of Anna from Bradford, which we just spoke about, which is a case of a vulnerable young girl in residential care. She was 14 years old. She was repeatedly raped. She spoke to the local council. She reported them. When she was 15, she actually ended up getting married in a traditional Islamic ceremony to her abuser, and her local social worker, exactly. Her local social worker actually showed up in attendance as a guest at their wedding. No one stopped the wedding. Following that, the social worker and the authorities actually arranged for her to then be fostered, almost adopted, fostered by the parents of her abuser. That's one example where it seems like at every single level, local institutions were complicit in the abuse and the rape of a young, vulnerable girl living in residential care. The second example, and these are just 2 examples of many, Sabir Ahmed was the ringleader of the Rochdale rape gang. He was employed as a welfare rights officer by the local Oldham Council. Not one person has been convicted for covering up these institutionalized rapes. And the only way that I see forward, and lots of people see forward, is to have a full-blown national inquiry at a huge expense to the public, but I think the public craving this to happen, which the National Crime Agency takes over, investigates these councils, and it's not just 5 councils. Every single time we look into a new town, these cases, the exact same pattern presents itself. So a national inquiry covering 50 or so towns in the country to investigate what has occurred and which local institutions and which local officers are complicit. This isn't happening, right? Labour's just said, we're not going to do this anymore. We'll hand over control to the local councils. And there haven't really been any other plans drafted up for the kind of national inquiry I've just mentioned. Where do we go from here?
So I want to provide some more details, if I may. The reason we can't rely on councils to mark their own homework, for example, Oldham Council that knew they couldn't carry out the required impartial investigation that would involve an inquiry, which is the reason this entire scandal got set in motion, because they asked the Home Office to do one at a national level with government support, and Jess Phillips turned around and said no. Safeguarding Minister at the Home Office, Jess Phillips. The reason we know they can't do this is because in Rotherham, one sitting councillor was implicated in the rapes. In Rotherham, there have now been 3 police officers arrested with charges relating to historic child sexual abuse and exploitation. I believe it was in Rotherham as well that one police officer who was involved in the drug and sex trade, because a lot of these Pakistani rape gangs are also selling drugs, and the insinuation is that some people in the authorities might be getting a cut of this. The police officer died in mysterious circumstances in a hit and run. So there are a lot of questions about to what level the authorities are involved, and so a national statutory inquiry would be necessary, because you can't trust the authorities in these towns and cities that have overseen the abuses of these white working class girls, thousands over decades, to conduct a due and impartial inquiry. And as you've said, 50 towns and cities are implicated in this. They're only focusing on 5.
That we know of.
That we know of. Yes, well, we don't know the extent to which these have been operating in London. It's the most popular city in the country. It's received the largest amount of inward migration from the kinds of regions where not just the Islamic faith, but specifically Pakistan, from where these perpetrators have come from. And we don't have a large presence of rape gangs in London. And when Sadiq Khan has been pressed on this by the likes of David Curtin or his rival in the last mayoral election, he has accused anyone trying to overturn that particular stone of institutional Islamophobia and racism. So deflection after deflection after deflection. And as far as the efforts focused on pushing for a national inquiry go, on the 8th of January, as I covered for Courage Media, the Conservatives forced a vote in the Houses of Parliament on it, and only a few Northern Ireland parties, Reform UK and the Conservative opposition, voted for the amendment to Labour's schools bill to force a national inquiry on this. Every other party and MP voted against, and or a couple of them abstained. Ever since, Labour made a compromise with these 5 national inquiries, and they chose the day before parliamentary recess for Easter, where they were going to go off for 2 weeks, to announce that the inquiries were not being forced to go ahead. But as you'd mentioned, and this is something that Robbie Moore, who's the MP for Keighley in the Bradford district, where late last year they just had a recent round of convictions for rape gangs, as he has been noticing on X and been holding panels in Parliament about this. They had originally promised that the head of the Telford inquiry in 2022, that's Tom Crowther, KC, was going to set the parameters for these 5 inquiries. So he was an independent KC who has experience in investigating these kinds of historic sexual abuses. Crowther had to call the Home Office on the 14th of February asking, do you still want me? Because he had heard nothing. And then he was told that he was not needed because instead civil servants and ministers were going to set the parameters for the inquiry. Now, these same Home Office civil servants and ministers only last year, in response to a request by Yvette Cooper to do a rapid analytical sprint of counter-terror legislation, had called the rape gangs, quote, a grievance narrative that is invented by the far right. So they had dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. And Labour have twice denounced that report, but it shows you the kind of institutional approach to the rape gangs within the civil service and within Labour. So they can't be trusted to do it. And then, as you mentioned, the £5 million that they had said was available for the inquiries have been turned into a competing fund, so the councils have to make their case for their portion of the funds, and they can now be spent on victim support measures, which means that they could be funneled into some nebulous social program which doesn't actually help the victims who themselves are asking for inquiries to hold their abusers to account. And so that means that people that helped cover up or actively facilitate the abuse will never be prosecuted. Mm. And some of those names include Angela Rayner's, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, lead advisor. He was head of Oldham Council at the times that these abuses were going on. And then there's also the current Telford MP, Sean Davies, who was the head of Telford Council, who said that these things were not happening in Telford, when of course the Telford inquiry proves that they were. Mm. So what the Conservatives, I think, are doing now...
He was the MP, when people came to him with these problems, when they were first discovered, he completely dismissed them. There was a new MP, the Conservative MP, Lucy Allen, who did incredible work in this area and really hammered home in the Commons. She was one of the only MPs really talking about this for a long, long time. And she was being harassed in her constituency office for going out of her way to talk about this as a women's rights issue. She was obviously voted out. He's back in. And it's the same situation. By
her own party as well. This is very important. Some Conservatives have been excellent on this. Robert Jenrick, Katie Lamb, Nick Timothy, Neil O'Brien, Chris Philp. You can name quite a few good ones. Victoria Atkins, the former Health Secretary, according to Lucy, summoned her to her office and said, why are you talking about this? You don't want to be another troublemaker like Sarah Champion, the Labour MP for... Rochdale, I believe, who raised a stink about this in The Sun in 2017 and was deselected from Jeremy Corbyn's front bench for saying Britain has a problem with Pakistani men raping white working class girls. And she put the estimate at 250,000 by then, so it's doubtless going to be more.
She was also an incredible, voice in this area.
She was, until Rupert Lowe decided to get up in Parliament and say that we should be looking into this, we should deport any foreign nationals or dual nationals responsible, we should deport the family members who knew about this and covered it up. And then she... wrang her hands at the language.
Think
of the language. and then came out after voting against the national inquiry, supporting a national inquiry anyway. So,
well, this is interesting, actually, sort of going back to that point earlier. You mentioned the vote for this national inquiry. I was told at the time, and many people were, including those MPs, we're not going to vote for this for politically expedient reasons. It happens in politics all the time. For example, in the last, when the Tories were in charge, Labour would produce a bill that seemed fairly sensible. No, we're going to do our own thing, tweaked it slightly. This brand new Conservative government bill. Okay, fine. Fears are allayed. Then you ended up with this watered down 5 towns inquiry, which has now been completely dropped. It's very hard not to feel, and not to sort of put your tinfoil hat on again, to feel like a conspiracy theorist, to say that at every single level, our institutions have failed these vulnerable young girls, including now, for sure, the government of the day.
Well, Jess Phillips is especially culpable in this because she only gave other ministers 45 minutes notice for this urgent update the day before parliamentary recess. So you barely had time to prepare the rebuttal statements or urgent questions to put to her, and so that further amendments couldn't be brought to stop this being dropped. When Katie Lamb delivered her speech back to Jess Phillips saying, do you accept that the crimes by these rapists are racially and religiously aggravated, producing a new section of a transcript, by the way, procured by the excellent Adam Wren, who's been doing work on this, by one of the rapists saying, we're here to F white girls, we're here to F the government. So pretty explicit about the racial, religious and political motivation of the rapes. Jess Phillips got up and accused Katie Lamb of minimising all sorts of other child abuse. They were sitting there the entire time with faces that were a mixture of boredom or anger that the opposition had even dared bring up these crimes that they would rather brush under the rug. And the reason they'd rather brush it under the rug is because the likes of Jess Phillips, but also other ministers like Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting, have their seats under threat by independent pro-Gaza Muslim MPs. Jess Phillips at the last election was narrowly victorious over a Workers' Party of Britain candidate who campaigned almost exclusively on the issue of Gaza in her seat of Birmingham Yardley, which is 43% Muslim. She won by 693 votes. So it's pretty clear that she does not want to upset her Muslim voters. It's the same reason that these stories were brushed under the carpet for years. It is not wanting to inflame racial tensions and not wanting to upset community cohesion. Well, I'm sorry, if the price for community cohesion and racial harmony, as Tom Holland, the historian, once said, is appeasing Pakistani rapists abusing white working class girls in care homes, murdering, raping and torturing them, and not talking about it, if that is the price, I don't want community cohesion with that community. I don't want them here at all. I think I'm with Rupert Lowe on this. Any foreign national or dual national that is found to have either participated in the gangs or knowingly covered it up, as many family members did and excused it when at trial, they should be sent home immediately. And Tahir Ali ignited this conversation recently about wanting to build an airport in Mirpur, Pakistan, with British taxpayer cash. Now, Mirpur is the specific region in Pakistan, where a majority of these perpetrators came from after floods in the late 60s, early 70s. Lots moved over to Britain, and that's when the rape gang started. I am not interested in building an airport in Mirpur unless it receives more deportation flights than departure flights. That is the only reason that we should be interested in that.
Well, I think to clarify, their advocacy was to the government of Pakistan for them to build the airport. No doubt, I imagine probably some British foreign aid would find its way into that. But the point still stands that there are a group of MPs in this country advocating for development infrastructure projects in different countries in which they also have an interest.
In the specific country
it's very
where
strange.
These perpetrators have come from. And so the only thing to add to this now is the response we're going to get. So there are 3 outcomes here. The Conservatives are trying to table an amendment to the Police and Crime Bill to push again for a national inquiry vote, which the Labour Party and the Labour government will obviously say, well, they're just trying to tank our bill again, we're going to vote against it. Now, Labour could table their own national inquiry. They've been pushing for all sorts of national inquiries. I think they've done about 10 since they've come to power. So they could do this of their own volition and not tank one of their own bills, but it's very telling they don't, because they don't want to estrange the Muslim vote on which they rely as a client bloc. The second option is Rupert Lowe's independent inquiry. Reform UK promised to do an independent inquiry. Nigel Farage promised to do it on LBC, and in Parliament promised to fund it independently, to bring forward witnesses and cases and the like, to get all the evidence out in the open.
He said, I'll have no problem finding funding for an independent inquiry. He
Yes,
said that.
He did not take that up. Rupert Lowe, after being ejected from Reform UK, has taken that up, and now Nigel Farage has told GB News, well, what's the point of doing it anyway, because it's not statutory. Now, that's not what he said back in January. He was saying that even if it's not statutory, it's the morally right thing to do to get all the evidence out in the open. And I happen to agree with Rupert Lowe here. Nigel Farage now, as of yesterday, has done a video address learning about Labour scrapping these inquiries, and has quite rightly said they're not doing this because they don't want to upset the apple cart regarding Muslims and losing all of their votes, because they're coming under threat from pro-Gaza candidates. They've been harsher on white Britons who have made ill-advised Facebook posts in the aftermath of the Southport killing. Charlie Peters yesterday unveiled that there have been more people to date in Rotherham imprisoned for the protest outside the Asylum Hotel, it's 88 people, than there have for the rape gangs, which is only 68, when we know that hundreds of thousands of girls were raped and hundreds of men have participated. And so Farage has turned around and said, we're not going to do an independent inquiry because it's a waste of money, but we are going to do a judicial review. Now, the problem with that is of what?
Of what?
Because you have to establish the facts and those involved ahead of time before you can take a judicial review forward. Because a judicial review scrutinises the actions by an employee or a public body and tries to find out whether or not there's any misconduct there. Until we know the names and the people involved in all of this, until we've established the facts, we can't bring forward a judicial review. So actually, a national or at least an independent inquiry is the prerequisite for a judicial review. So what would be best, despite bad blood between Farage and Lowe, is after, predictably, the National Inquiry amendment by the Conservatives is shot down by the Labour government, for everyone to get behind Lowe's independent inquiry and for all parties involved to lend their interest to this. The only party that I don't think will want to be involved is the Liberal Democrats, because the only people more disgusting than the Labour Party were actually two Lib Dem MPs. Because after Katie Lamb delivered her speech, one Lib Dem MP called Tessa Munt got up to say that it is actually white men doing the abuse, shouting with invective that it's white men responsible. And then there was Munira Wilson, who's also a Lib Dem, and she said, as someone who has Muslim family, who has brown skin, we feel increasingly uncomfortable in our own country, given the attacks we hear every day, day after day, from the Conservatives on all Muslims. So, while the Conservative Party, at large, Reform UK, Rupert Lowe, unsurprising members of the public, like Adam Wren, are doing all they can to seek justice for these girls, the Liberal Democrats want you to know that actually them being offended is what matters.
And to be clear, I mean, I don't think there's been any Tory MP, for example, that hasn't been very careful about accusing every single Muslim in the country, right? But there is a specific problem with these gangs that the people who are perpetrators seem to be from predominantly from Pakistani and sometimes maybe Bangladeshi backgrounds. And that is just a fact that has been uncovered. And it is these kind of situations which need to be investigated. You mentioned the Rupert Lowe inquiry. I suppose my only question there is he hasn't raised so much money so far. I wonder whether he will be able to raise a lot of money, the kind of money that is needed to run a national inquiry. He obviously won't have the statutory power to compel witnesses. And so would an inquiry of this sort just be a glorified panorama investigation? And if so, would it then still be useful anyway?
So he's raised over £500,000, which is an excellent start. I think it's the largest crowdfunder of its kind in British political history, at least. I would assume, I know for a fact, that some people are taking part without requiring any pay, just to ensure that evidence can be compiled and got out there. So some people are just very interested, and these are subject experts, in ensuring that the world knows the facts of the case. And also it is useful to have everything on record, on film, televised, spread around social media, because we wouldn't have this conversation about a national inquiry if not for the transcripts and the case reports going viral on X in the first place. As far as, is it just going to be a glorified panorama documentary, I believe what they're going to do is call upon the MPs and the social workers, police officers, members of the council, and now in the civil service, senior advisors at the Home Office who downplayed this earlier in their career, they're going to call upon them to appear. And in their absence, if they choose not to appear, they're going to put a photo of them up and read the questions to them anyway. And their abdication of their invite is just as damning as them squirming while on the stand and giving insufficient answers to these questions. So having all the information in one place can be then the prerequisite to launching that judicial review, which I think Nigel Farage is right to call for, but he needs to compile the facts in the public domain in the first place. So, and the final thing on this is, even if it's not statutory, doing nothing is not an option. It is the morally right thing to do to get this all out in the open, and the victims themselves are asking for it. They've been asking for a national inquiry. If they are forced to settle for a privately funded and public inquiry instead, I think that's the best course of action. So I would encourage people, if they can help with compiling evidence, or if they're so inclined to donate, to do so, because for the time being, it's the absolute best we're going to get. And as far as I know, all of the people involved in it have good intentions.
Okay, well, that's good. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. As long as it's run sensibly, to produce sort of useful results. As we said previously, there are only a handful of journalists who are actually doing really incredible work at highlighting this problem, and they've kind of been left to their own devices for so long. So if there was money behind them, and if there was a serious inquiry, getting some of this information to light, that would be very useful. I suppose I just wanted to end actually by referencing the speech that was given in the Commons by Katie Lamb. And at the end, she notes a specific case out loud, which is incredibly harrowing. But I want our listeners to hear, maybe for the first time, the kind of abuse that these young, vulnerable victims have had to face. And this is just one account of many. The problem is, speaking to reporters, often when the sentences are handed down in these cases, they're not able to speak on GB News, on the BBC, on Sky News, and relay actually the facts of the case as were delivered at sentencing. The reason is because they are just so harrowing and they're not fit for TV, for public consumption. We can do that. I don't know what the rules on YouTube are, whether we'll have to sort of take it down or edit it out. But we should just listen now. It's about a minute long, and we should just finish with that.
Sentencing Mohammed Karar of Oxford to life in prison, Judge Peter Rook said, "You prepared your victim, a 13-year-old girl, for gang anal rape by using a pump to expand her anal passage. You subjected her to gang rape by 5 or 6 men. At one point, she had 4 men inside her. A red ball was placed in her mouth to keep her quiet. When she was 12, after raping her, she threatened you with your lock knife. Your reaction was to pick up a baseball bat with a silver metal handle, strike her on the head with it, and then insert it inside her vagina. This is not about me. It is not about the minister or the Home Secretary or any of us in this chamber. It is about them, little girls up and down our country whose brutal and repeated rapes were permitted and hidden by those in the British state whose job was to protect them. They deserve justice. In 5 towns, these children and their families may get partial answers. But I have mentioned 5 towns in the last few minutes alone, and there are at least 45 more. In those places, they will get no answers at all. What does the minister have to say to them? The British people deserve to know the truth. What darker truths does the suffering of these girls reveal about this country? And why won't the government find out?
So there you have it. I mean, that's, like I said, one example.
That case was the transcript that Max Tempers posted on X, which caught the attention of Elon Musk and sent this global. And so what we're facing is a real divide here. We're facing a divide between the kinds of people who hear that for the first time, like Katie Lamb, whose voice was breaking as she was reading it out, whose conscience is just racked by that. I find that stuff very difficult to listen to. It just fills me with rage. And then on the other side, is Labour's front bench, who, while she was reading that out, were sitting there grimacing, wondering how they were going to spin refusing to investigate crimes such as those which are still going on today as a positive thing.